Hey, good morning, everyone. I have the privilege of calling us all together this morning. My name is Reed Pauley. I'm a research fellow here at the Belfer Center with the project on managing the atoms and the International Security Program. Today's panel is perhaps the most timely panel the Belfer Center has had. Many of our panelists stayed up late last night fielding media requests and watching as the news was coming in. We'd like to thank both the Korea Project and the Belfer Center for putting this on. Their sponsors or co-sponsors from SBS Research Fund at the Harvard University Korea Institute. And I'd like to acknowledge as well C.G. Kim and C.G. Michi and Lieutenant General Isobe, who are in the audience. We look forward to hearing their thoughts as well. This is, as I said, incredibly timely, and we will forgive our panelists if they have to check their phones because there's information still coming in. But hopefully this will be a constructive conversation that leads to answering the question that we're fortunate enough that was a question in the title that said whether this is the beginning of real negotiations or not. It's possible that even though this was a temporary failure, there may be working negotiations that come out as a result of it. So with that, let me introduce each of our panelists. We'll go down starting from my left in order, and they'll each get about 8 minutes or so for a short take, and then we'll have a conversation together. So it's a pleasure here to have Dr. Catherine Moon, who's a professor of political science in the Wasserman Chair of Asian Studies at Wellesley College. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and was the inaugural holder of the South Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies. Next, we'll have Dr. John Park, who's the director of the Korea Project and an adjunct lecturer here at the Kennedy School. He's a faculty affiliate of Project on Managing the Atom and has run multiple 1.5 track to 1.5 conversations, part of the U.S. Institute for Peace, and prior to that was a Goldman Sachs Boston Consulting Group. I see he's actually changed positions, so we will in fact go down the panel, but I just for a second. Next we have Dr. Gary Seymour, who is the Senior Executive Director of the Crown Center and Professor of the Practice of Politics at Brandeis University. And we miss him here because, of course, he was formerly the Executive Director for Research at the Belfer Center, and we still have him as a non-resident senior fellow. Finally, we have William Tobey, who's the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Defense, Nuclear Nonproliferation, and National Nuclear Security Administration from 2006 to 2009. He's here affiliated with the Project on Managing the Atom. And he served at the National Security Council staff under 3 presidents. I should also mention we have a little bit of a gift of having 2 scholarly perspectives on the panel, as well as 2 practitioner perspectives. Dr. Gary Seymour and Will Tobey have both negotiated with North Koreans in the past. Dr. Seymour during the Green Framework process especially, and Will Tobey in the 6-party talks. So with that, let me pass the floor over to Dr. Catherine Moon.
Okay, I won't drink my coffee. We're asked to speak for a limited period of time, so I'm just going to go through and make about 5 points. Contrary to much of the headlines that you saw in the papers last night, today, I think this was a great success. I think the failure was a success, and here are my reasons. Number 1, Donald Trump finally encountered the fact that his so-called self-dubbed charm offensive, his personality politics, has its limits, and that now real experts need to do the work. He confronted the real North Korea, which plays hardball when it comes to diplomatic strategy, tactics, and we now know for sure that this is going to be a long haul. Nothing fast, even though the Trump administration in recent days has been lowering expectations and officials have been saying this is going to be a longer process. This Hanoi summit is such a contrast to the, I would say, absurd, euphoric expectations that had been set up for Singapore. So finally, reality hits. That's good. Number 2, there's clear evidence that North Korea does not have any serious intentions to give up or bargain away its nuclear program. And if it does, it's going to be, again, a long process with very hard negotiations, and that the U.S. or any other powers, including South Korea, should not expect a complete, what we call a complete denuclearization process as part of any near-term process. So that's really good to know, because then the U.S. and other countries can try to accommodate strategy toward that reality. Number 3, I would say another good thing that happened is that Mr. Trump was reined in, contained by his senior advisors, primarily Pompeo and Steve Biegun, who serves as the special advisor on North Korea. The information I read is that Trump could have given away quite a bit to the North Koreans had he been permitted to. But the Pompeo, the Bieguns, they actually tried to minimize the time that Trump had alone with Kim, and also made it very clear that there is no way that a full reduction or elimination of the sanctions is a possibility at this point. So it's good that there are so-called adults in the room advising this process with more confidence and to more constructive impact. I also think that there are some positive aspects on the sidelines of the summit, the heads of state meetings, that tell us something about North Korea. Number 1, DPRK officials, high-level ones, Lee Soo-young, the veteran diplomat and former foreign minister, as well as Oh Soo-young, the head of the Economic Affairs Department of the Korea Workers' Party. They took a side trip prior to the serious set of meetings between the two heads of state to visit a UNESCO tourism site in Vietnam, as well as to visit the city of Haiphong, the Dinh Vu Industrial Park, where VinFast, which is part of the largest, wealthiest conglomerate in Vietnam, very successful, where VinFast has numerous factories that produce a range of items from automobiles to developing real estate, educational objects, etc. And this was a way for the two leaders, two officials, to have a peek inside what's productive and possible economically. And then, and also Kim Jong-un is staying on. And so he will presumably tour Vietnam as well and get a better sense of the changes in Vietnam. I think these are very good things. And the last thing I will offer here is that when Steve Biegun gave the speech that everybody talks about prior to his going to Hanoi, he set a larger framework for DPRK, U.S. or U.S.-DPRK relations, to include not only denuclearization and sanctions reductions or elimination, but also to include humanitarian aid, possibly people-to-people exchange. I think we need to broaden the agenda. There needs to be many more confidence-building measures on multiple levels with the DPRK before Americans in general can actually see real progress and trust in that progress. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Now we have Dr. Seymour.
So I'll also be brief. I mean, in a way, a failed summit is a lot easier to talk about than a successful summit because there's not as much substance there. So there were 2 issues going into the Hanoi meeting that were in contention. The first issue was the extent of constraint on North Korea's production of fissile material. Kim Jong-un had offered to dismantle the Yongbyon facility, which would have limited but not ended fissile material production in North Korea. The U.S., based on Steve Biegun's speech at Stanford, was looking for a complete freeze and dismantlement of fissile material production facilities, which would have included not just Yongbyon, but undeclared enrichment plants outside of Yongbyon. The second issue was what price would the U.S. pay? there was agreement. There was agreement that the U.S. would offer to establish liaison offices and to issue a peace declaration. The issue in contention was sanctions relief. Would there be any, and how much of it? Now, John Park and I were in Korea, Seoul, Korea, last week, and the Koreans were pushing the idea that the sanctions relief would be limited to resumption of South-North economic projects. Kumgang Mountain, resort, and Kaesong Industrial Park, and roads and transportation, and so forth. And I think that Seoul was trying to mediate a deal between Pyongyang and Washington that was built around dismantlement of Yongbyon in exchange for peace declaration, liaison offices, and South-North economic cooperation. And I thought that's where we were headed. I thought the summit was going to produce a small deal as a first step toward denuclearization that had those principal elements. So we know it failed. We know the American version why it failed is because Kim Jong-un asked for much more than just a resumption of South-North economic cooperation. According to the American version, he asked for all sanctions to be lifted in exchange for dismantlement of Yongbyon. If that was really the proposal on the table, then Trump and the U.S. team were absolutely right to walk away. I don't think anybody would have supported giving up all of our leverage simply for a reduction in fissile material production. That is really a non-starter. Now, we haven't heard the North Korean version of events, but it may turn out that it was the Americans who upped the ante and insisted that dismantlement of Yongbyon is not enough, that we need to have all fissile material production ended. And I have always thought that's more of a concession that Kim Jong-un is prepared to make at this very early stage of the denuclearization process. So for the future, I agree with Kathy. I think this could turn out to be a very positive learning experience for both leaders. It wasn't just that Trump may now recognize that personal chemistry and warmth is no substitute for preparation. I think Kim may now have recognized that he can't deal with Trump directly and circumvent the rest of the U.S. government. So for both leaders, I think this actually may in the end turned out to be a failure with positive consequences. So in the answer to the question, is this the beginning of negotiations? Yes, I think it will be the beginning of real negotiations between Biden and his counterpart, Ambassador Kim Hyok-chol. Now, whether they come to an agreement on some roadmap or some initial step, I think it's far too early to tell, and we probably won't know for some time. But in the meantime, I think the double freeze will continue to be in place. North Korea will not test nuclear weapons and missiles, and the U.S. and the ROK will not conduct major military exercises. Hopefully, the negotiations among the experts actually produces enough of an agreement so a third summit can take place before the U.S. elections. But in any event, it seems to me the most important thing is that the process not collapse at this point. And I think both Trump and Kim are invested in keeping it alive for the time being. Now, we'll have to wait and see what the North Koreans say, but I think Trump walked away in a very gracious way by showering compliments on Kim Jong-un, and obviously for some people that sticks in our craw, given what a murderous dictator he is. But in terms of diplomacy, it was the right way to break off the meeting. And let's wait and see how the North Koreans respond, whether they go back to calling Trump a dotard or whether they say that he's a great man and that Kim still has great faith in his genuine interest in North Korea's future.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Seymour. Will Toby, the floor is yours.
President Trump entered this summit brimming with self-confidence, but devoid of serious preparation. In a way, it was not surprising because Steve Biegun had found it very difficult to find any serious discussions with the North. And so there wasn't really much going into the summit in terms of a roadmap or serious preparation that would lead to a relatively detailed agreement that could come out of it. And of course, this was not surprising because the North had been taught that the best way to deal with the United States was to deal with the president directly. He offered important concessions in Singapore, didn't get much for them, and in terms of, for example, postponing exercises, and also because he's incapable of dealing with the highly detailed issues that would be inherent in a verifiable agreement. That perception in the North has now been dispelled. They now know that they can't get an agreement without a more detailed discussion. And I think that I agree with other panelists that that's a positive development. The ideal result from an American perspective, not necessarily a realistic one, the ideal result of the summit would have been some sort of general framework that would lead to the verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. You do this, they do that. But of course, there was always the danger that the sides might veer off in the direction that Gary outlined. Instead of complete denuclearization, we would pursue episodic denuclearization, the destruction of an individual facility in return for serious and very likely irreversible political concessions. Again, I think that's a danger that's been avoided, at least for the moment, and that's a positive development, because I work from the assumption that partial denuclearization is not denuclearization, that it's a binary outcome. It either is or it isn't. So again, I think in that regard, it's better than Singapore. And then I would conclude with a final thought, reminding people of the Reykjavik summit, which was widely perceived as a failure at the time, because the two sides got to the brink and had actually made some concessions to each other, but couldn't agree on the final price. Similar outcome seems to have occurred here, and yet the Reykjavik summit led directly to the INF Treaty, which for about 30 years advanced international security. So the answer to the question, in my view, is it's the start of the negotiation.
Okay, I'm glad we added that question mark to the title. Thanks very much. Well, John, the floor is yours now.
Well, thank you all for being here today. To add what my colleagues mentioned here, I wanted to paint the picture of the before and after, because the picture was becoming more and more clear that the decision had been made to move away from the focus on denuclearization to make it a focus on trying to increase the prospects of peace on the Korean Peninsula. And so it looked like changing the narrative gave an opportunity to move the focus away from the very problematic issues of denuclearization. And with that, the logic and the story that developed was essentially, it wasn't just a single summit, but a process. And the narrative there is that the Singapore summit was effective when you view it in that context. The Singapore summit produced the 4 principles. That was essentially the roadmap. And then you would have Hanoi essentially becoming early stages of operationalizing on that. So here at Singapore, the 4 summits in quick summary. Number 1 was establish a new U.S.-North Korea relationship. The second was to build a peace regime. The third, commit to denuclearization as laid out in the Panmunjom Declaration, the core inter-Korean agreement. And then lastly, committing to recovery of MIA POW remains. So this is where Hanoi looked like you could see it from that angle of this process, and you would give yourself some room in terms of growing into the potential here. So the action items were to give a sense of progress. And within this type of paradigm, you're looking at the connection to the statement. The liaison offices and the announcement of the liaison office would serve both the symbolic importance of moving forward on this new type of relationship, but also laying out the mechanisms through which the two sides could start talking on a more regular basis as they hammered out the details of the more contentious issues. Then the second piece of this was a declaration to announce the end of the Korean War. The argument there was that this would be convenient because it's a political document. You didn't have to go through the hoops of an official process to ratify it. The whole idea that aspirationally you would work towards a peace treaty, but it would serve a very important function in terms of reinforcing that the priority now was to create this dynamic of peace on the Korean Peninsula. Acknowledging that there had to be some movement on denuclearization as well, there was a lot of discussion, particularly in Seoul, about Yongbyon and how dismantlement of some of the facilities there could give the tangible evidence that North Korea was making the early steps to denuclearization. It would take time, but this would be an important first step. Now, the part that I think is interesting is we all know that sanctions and unwinding sanctions would be problematic. And the connection there seemed to be that if President Trump and Chairman Kim were to make the next step forward in Hanoi, South Korea would essentially be the off-balance sheet approach to dealing with the sanctions issue. You wouldn't have to do any type of touching of the sanctions that are very much the pillar of maximum pressure, the Trump administration approach, and remains the primary approach to dealing with the North Korean issue. These would be essentially going through the inter-Korean mechanism, restarting Kaesong Industrial Complex, the Kumgansan tourism site as well. So you get to see this very elegant type of design and picture. And the way to see how credible the next step forward would be was that everyone was lowering their expectations. And you reinforce to that the fact that President Trump and Chairman Kim would use their subjective indicators of whether this was successful or not. So the definition of success for those on the outside didn't matter as long as Chairman Kim and President Trump had come to their understanding of what success looked like. So now focusing on the after, what happened? To be blunt, with that picture laid out and reports of a draft joint statement where essentially President Trump and Chairman Kim having a fantastic dinner the night before, the following day was more or less labeled as a formality. Again, it's not that this would be the definitive final agreement, but this would mark the beginning of a very difficult series of negotiations. What happened? Because that clearly was something that somewhat one or two parties did not follow this script. So under this heading of what happened, this is the growth industry right now. Everyone has their theory. But the piece that I find interesting is that, as Gary mentioned, we just have the U.S. press statement. We don't have any statements coming out of the North Korean piece, the North Korean side. But if it is the North Korean demand full lifting of sanctions in return for dismantling Yongbyon, the part that is a bit the outlier is that if there is any country that knows the complexity of the sanctions, it would be North Korea, because they are subject to both U.S. as well as UN Security Council sanctions. And the notion of North Korea watching as these other countries were not in the situation of having sanctions applied to them, but rather in an agreement situation where the nuclear issue, in the case of the Iran deal, the nuclear issue had been dealt with. The countries involved were unwinding their sanctions, but you see how long it took. It was something that you see the dynamic of the private sector. You have other elements that just don't neatly line up after you have the agreement done. And so the part that doesn't add up is, number one, the full lifting of sanctions being the type of demand that would be a one type of deal, that you would put Yongbyon and nothing else that was discussed as a part of a big ask from the North Korean side. The other part that doesn't add up was the aspect of the North Koreans and the South Koreans having a much deeper level of communication and coordination on these issues. Some elements of the U.S. and the South Korean side coordinating, where it was a lot about expectations, and the lowering of expectations increased the likelihood that you would have this first step. So the final piece I mentioned is, as we open up to Q&A, is when you look at it from the mood in Seoul, when we were there, the focus wasn't so much on the North Korean side, it was on the U.S. side. The sentiment being that for the U.S., President Trump was the blessing in the sense that we got this far, that the summits were actually taking place, but the source of concern that things could change on a dime. I think in South Korea, everyone was walking on eggshells. So in many respects, that nightmare came true. But the element of what comes next, as much as President Trump in the press conference said this was a part of the process, that if anything, rather than a gap, in the course of the 36 hours, they got to know each other better, and they became closer. It seems that some of the messages already coming out lead to a larger question mark with this issue now becoming a lower priority and almost fully in the domain of President Moon having to deal with this and pick up the pieces. So what comes next, I think, is very, very unclear at this particular point in time.
Thank you, John. Right before we open it to Q&A, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and just ask you to respond to each other a little bit. I thought John brought up an excellent point at the end there about thinking about in the aftermath of the Iran deal, where we had partial sanctions relief, yet a likely oversold benefit to that. So the Iranians believed, or at least it seems they believe, that there would be more business than was actually willing to come back to now opening Iran, given that other sanctions remain. Are the North Koreans learning from this, or is this not an appropriate analogy that they're drawing from? Let's go down the panel again. Feel free to pass. Okay.
I'll pass for now.
So I think it's hard to answer that question without knowing whether the American narrative is accurate. I mean, the story that President Trump and Secretary of State Pompeo said is that Kim Jong-un miscalculated, that he overreached by demanding all sanctions be lifted in exchange for what is a relatively minor step, dismantlement of Yongbyon. And I think without knowing whether that's true or not, I think it's very difficult to answer your question. It wouldn't be unusual for the North Koreans to, in the middle of a negotiation, to change their demands and to ask for much more. I mean, that's actually quite a common tactic. And Kim Jong-un may have thought, with his friend Trump, he might be able to get a really sweet deal. And now that has, turned out not to be true, the North Koreans, they come back with a much more realistic position, which asks for only a modification, partial sanctions relief, in exchange for dismantlement of Yongbyon. I think the sanctions are constructed in such a way that partial sanctions relief is pretty easy to organize. You can modify the UN Security Council resolutions, which have provisions that deal with very specific sectoral sanctions, and you can either suspend or remove those restrictions. As John said, there's a lot of north-south activity that could go ahead if the U.S. was willing to not impose sanctions on South Korean companies that engage in that activity. So I think partial sanctions relief as part of an overall process toward denuclearization is still a very effective bargaining tool that the U.S. has to use, and it's about the only leverage we have.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, please.
Could you go back?
Yes.
Just, you triggered a couple things. I mean, I think, number one, the Iran deal in general, and then the JCPOA, the JCPOA, yes. When that was happening, many people asked if this is going to have an impact on North Korea. And obviously this is still the same question. To what extent are North Koreans aware and watching? My answer is, I don't think they care that much, because I think they look at themselves as very unique. Both unique in terms of its role in the region, and also they don't threaten the United States as a regional rising power, the way Iran might be as a hegemon, right? They just want to be left alone in as safe a way as possible, if you speak about it in a humble sense. Plus, I think with this personal approach to the heads of states meeting, I don't think the Iran framework really has much of an impact. So that's number one. Number two, I looked at KCNA, the North Korean state, DPRK state news in Korean this morning to see if they had covered anything about the so-called walkout and failure. What's interesting is, at least when I checked not long ago, not yet, there was such a rosy picture that was made on the state news. And so the North Korean public would be consuming information or a narrative of hope. There was a lot of hope. And that the best efforts and sincere efforts on the part of both Kim and Trump will be apparent, etc. So, as Gary says, we don't know what happened. because if North Korea does have to worry about domestic politics, like all people, including authoritarian and leaders and dictators, domestic politics still matters. They pitched it one way. Now they're going to have to pitch it another way, and I think we'll learn more by watching that transition, if there is indeed one. So something went awry, and so the North Koreans, now the elites have to figure out how to tell the public what happened or what didn't happen in a way that doesn't make them lose face. And so it's hard to answer, a question about Iran framework or any other framework.
Will Telby, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I think just briefly on Kathy's point, the fact that they've been slow to correct their narrative shows that they were taken by surprise. So this was an unexpected outcome for the North. On the incentive issue, one of the ideas that was reportedly floated and that we know that at least the U.S. side contemplated was creating a package, an appealing package, and holding it in escrow. We haven't heard anything, so far as I know, about that idea post-summit. And we don't know what, if anything, was said about it inside the summit. But my guess is that that concept remains on the table, and it could address the Iran issue. Although I also agree with the other statements that North Korea regards itself as unique.
Interesting idea. The second follow-up I wanted to have was Dr. Seymour mentioned the outlook that the freeze for freeze seems to still be in place, and just with that in mind, it does seem that that is, even if it continues, it's opening or continuing to open a window for these talks. But how long will that window be open? Right? How long is it that we have before, say, the North or Kim feels that he needs to start testing, or that the United States and South Korea believe there's a readiness cost to not having exercises? How long do we have? Catherine.
That's another question that's difficult to answer. Look, as far as the exercises goes, U.S. ROK exercises, there are so many of them. They're very diverse, and both governments can pick and choose which ones to engage in without scaring the hell out of the North Koreans or making them provocative. So I think in terms of certain aspects of readiness, it's not a zero-sum game. I think the exercises that the North Koreans really object to are the huge, the spring, the winter, spring, February through April, etc., where you have about 300,000 troops, almost encircling North Korea. That will probably have to be on hold as long as the North Koreans continue to abstain from nuclear testing and missile launches. I think we need to look at how long can this diplomatic process continue rather than how long can we hold off on military exercises. Because Trump has a limited time before 2020 elections. If there is not substantial or some kind of significant progress that the American public and the international community can agree to, he's going to be in trouble. So we're not going to be able to prolong this kind of diplomatic process at this high level, which means that then everything else will have to follow suit in an accommodated way. Going back to big joint exercises on the peninsula, North Korea possibly upping its, going back to testing or upping the, increasing its reprocessing capacity. Something will happen to show that this particular diplomatic framework is not working. So I would look first toward this process rather than how long we can go on with some of these other issues.
Dr. Sim.
So I think there are two reasons for arguing that Kim Jong-un can tolerate a very long, extended continuation of the moratorium on testing. The first is a technical argument that he's already accomplished his primary objectives by testing a thermonuclear device and a rocket that at least has the range of an ICBM. at the end of 2017. So from his standpoint, a test moratorium doesn't really inflict a very high cost in terms of technical progress. The second reason for arguing that he can be patient is because Kim Jong-un is already benefiting from de facto sanctions relief. All of the sanctions still exist on paper, but both the Chinese and the Russians have relaxed enforcement of sanctions. And I am willing to bet that there are some secret Chinese subsidies we don't know about, which are helping to sustain the North Korean economy, despite the formal sanctions. With respect to military exercises, I think there's no pressure on Trump to resume the big military exercises. And we saw that again last night in his press conference. Trump is happy to suspend the exercises. He thinks they're a waste of money if the South Koreans don't pay for them. So that's one of the reasons I'm optimistic that the double freeze will remain in place for the foreseeable future. I mean, Kathy's right. We'll have to wait and see how the North Koreans respond to the failure in Hanoi, and that'll give us some indication. But until shown otherwise, I think the status quo is likely to continue, and then it'll be up to the experts and diplomats to try to see if they can actually work out a real agreement in time for a third summit, which I hope they can. But I also agree with Kathy that we don't have too much time left. I mean, by 2020, President Trump is going to be really consumed either by impeachment or by running for re-election, and I think we don't have much more time than a year or so before we can really make progress.
So,
So I think President Trump defines success as cessation of nuclear and ICBM testing. So as far as he's concerned, as long as we continue with that, he's comfortable. I would agree with Gary, too, that Kim Jong-un has already received political and economic benefits, and the likelihood is that those will grow over time because sanctions are tough to maintain. So I see this window as being potentially open for a long time. I think both leaders could deal with it. I would add one thing, and I would caution that the strength of the argument should be caveated, that there are limits to how far you can press this. But by engaging the North in a process of summits, Kim Jong-un's options have been somewhat constrained. And the reason is that in the past, if he didn't get, or the North didn't get the concessions it sought, the answer was to pop off a nuclear test or fire a volley of missiles to try and get the attention of the United States or China. And that argument is no longer really possible because, after all, the sides are supposedly talking. The two leaders have met. The North and South leaders have met. And so while it's possible that Kim Jong-un could go back to that path, he would pay a price for it. He would effectively forfeit much of the benefit that he's gained so far politically.
Just quickly, under the heading of the durability of the dual freeze and Kim Jong-un adhering to that because of the benefits from not testing, as Gary mentioned, the China piece is interesting. But the other element is Kim Jong-un is now focused on building up the economy, and he is reaching out to a lot of different countries. Staying behind, as reported, he could suddenly get back in his train and go back to Pyongyang, but it looks like the state visit with Vietnam is going to continue. As Kathy mentioned, there was a lot of visit of economic projects and so forth. This is where the part of the U.S. maximum pressure on sanctions is interesting. Not so much sanctioning North Korea, but sanctioning these potential interlocutors of the North Koreans. If that's the case, then we could see another round of sanctions. And the secondary sanction ones are particularly interesting because if the U.S. view is there's leakage, the Chinese aren't doing enough, we should use economic coercion against some of the Chinese players. That effectiveness we have to call into question because the other thing we have to kind of consider as we widen the aperture, we're in the middle of a U.S.-China trade war. And so from a Chinese calculation, if there wasn't a trade war, the increased likelihood of secondary sanctions on Chinese companies would be a strong consideration if that was a message from Washington. But because the Chinese are already subject to U.S. tariffs, I think there's an element that it's almost the type of time for the North Korean side that's interesting, in that they can continue with the dual freeze, but in a way that I don't think it's the traditional interpretation that things are going fine, but the internal pressure that Chairman Kim is now on, because he's publicly stated that he's going to deliver on economic development. So the internal dynamic in North Korea, if it plays out that this is a miscalculation on the North Korean side, to me that's a big question mark that becomes pretty problematic from a North Korean perspective.
Could I add one more point?
Please.
I'm
Yep.
sorry, I forgot. So President Trump defines success as cessation of nuclear and ballistic missile testing. I don't agree with that as a definition. An important point that he misses with that is the continued production of fissile material. So the North has enough fissile material between 40 to 60 weapons, according to press reports, and they're probably churning out an additional amount that's in the 5 to 7 weapons range each year. And that actually does affect the security in the peninsula along 5 dimensions that I don't need to go into here, but it is an important point.
Thanks. Okay, let's open it up to the audience now. If I ask you to introduce yourself, please, when I call on you, and keep it to one question with a question mark at the end, please. Let's start at the back.
Eugene Kogan, Belfer Center. We're dealing here with a country that already has nuclear weapons assembled. And I'm wondering if we can widen the aperture, but widen it historically to use the sort of Graham Allis's applied history framework. And think about cases where countries have actually given up existing nuclear weapons. And there are, to my mind, just 2 cases that come to mind in South Africa and Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, who never had operational control over those weapons. And I wonder if those cases can help us think through ways, either through, this is thinking very ambitiously and perhaps foolishly, but as a process of signaling the potential of reunification of Korea, we could envision the transfer of existing nuclear weapons under South Korean control, which raises the question of whether just existence of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula in itself is a non-negotiable for the United States, and whether maybe some kind of a sort of a Ukrainian option is a possibility here. So I kind of wanted to problematize the 0 to 100, that sort of the either it's a one or but sort of a binary choice that will you presented for us. But I also would love to hear from others.
Okay, we'll in fact take a couple of questions at a time. So we've got some great historical analogies there to work off of.
So thank you for a really excellent panel. The question I have is about the diplomatic process. At the first summit, a common critique was that by having a high-level summit without laying the groundwork, it left nowhere to go if it failed. And it sounds like from this panel that all of the panelists are describing, benefits to having the high-level engagement come before or as part of the lower-level process. There's now skin in the game. There's a couple other things that were mentioned. So the question I have for the group is, has the way this process has moved forward changed the way you've thought about how countries sort of non-proliferation, the diplomatic non-proliferation process?
Okay, and one more. Let's go with that. Yes.
Mariana Bujarin, Davis Center for Russian Immersion Studies. I was wondering how you would compare this administration's approach to North Korean problem or North Korean issues, which is to sort of normalize the context and perhaps pick or solve the lower-hanging fruit, pick the lower-hanging fruit to make the more difficult issues perhaps possible down the road, versus its approach towards Russia, which seems to be a complete inverse situation, where you go after the INF Treaty and such treaties, and that doesn't help to normalize the context in which, say, arms control happens.
Okay, thanks. Who would like to start this round? Let's start in the opposite direction. John.
Sure. I'll take a stab at the historical one. I mean, we've heard about Reykjavik and some of those examples. That's kind of it's proliferated in terms of the points there, because there are some direct relevance in terms of what just took place. And related to that, the idea is that no deal is better than a bad deal. but I'm treading into an area where it's a constructed reality. How the North Koreans really think about this, we kind of piece together. But if you did pattern recognition, you have an American president that has this domestic scrutiny, potentially impeachment. Then you start to think about the Chinese as they're in this process of normalization with the Nixon administration. And all told, that took 7 years, and it would span a Republican and a Democratic administration. So how the North Koreans are thinking about their partner, their U.S. partners, and tying into the other comment, this is high level, this is a top-down approach. So I'm wondering how they're trying to bring in their own historical analogies or talk to very close countries and learn from their experience as well. Because this is the part where the narrative, again, it laid out a particular logic, and you could make that logic fit based on lowering of expectations, subjective indicators. You do enough of these type of modifications, and you see the game plan. So I would think that this is a time period where trying to incorporate this setback, if there is a setback, again, we're kind of in this mode, we have to look for the North Korean statement on this, but there are a lot of pieces that don't add up. If this narrative no longer applies, then the game plan that connected the various countries and what they're dealing with collapses. Then we get into the point of very technical details. You hit that bar or you don't. So how North Korea right now is thinking of it, I would imagine that the Chinese example of that period of normalizing U.S.-China relations, I think there would be some interesting parallels that you could draw.
Anything to add, Bill?
On the prior cases analogy, I'd point out that all those cases really involve different governments. So that may not be a popular analogy in the North. It'd be fine with me, but not necessarily Kim Jong-un's preferred outcome. On the summit process, it's an interesting question. I would argue that we're headed to a return to normalcy of doing staff work now. And so it confirms the earlier analyses and the prior methods. It's just that we had to go through an additional step to get there. On the Russia question, Winston Churchill once complained that this pudding has no theme. And I don't really see a unifying grand strategy in Trump administration policy.
So, just on Nick's point, it would have been better if the Hanoi summit had produced an agreement, even a modest agreement, and then a commitment to try to negotiate a roadmap within some rough period of time. That obviously that's preferred, but that's not what happened. And so we're talking about, as Will says, this is a useful learning experience for both leaders that actually, for these summits to be successful, you need to have a lot of preparation. So I think that's the silver lining on this cloud. On the question about Russia, one area where there's a similarity is that in both cases, the president seems to be a bit disconnected from the rest of his administration on both North Korea and Russia. And I wonder whether this is a sign, the outcome of Hanoi is a sign that the president's focus is going to be much more on domestic issues and that he's less likely to be rogue on foreign policy issues going forward. We'll have to wait and see because there's obviously a lot of other things on the plate, Venezuela, South Asia, and so forth. But he does seem to have been constrained in Hanoi. I think in part because Will's right. From President Trump's standpoint, his policy toward North Korea is already a big success. So he doesn't need to do more controversial things. And to some extent, I think it's because he listened to the advice of his advisors that the deal on the table wasn't good enough. So I think on Russia, he's also increasingly seems to be following the advice of his administration as opposed to whatever his personal feelings are toward Putin.
Sure, just to respond to your question. Again, I think, this now a twofer series here between Singapore and Hanoi. I think this is an outlier, and I would hope it stays an outlier in diplomacy on nonproliferation. And I think the only reason it has even happened is because we have a very unusual leader in the United States who was willing to take a chance with Kim, but also Kim taking advantage of the fact that this is an unusual leader who wants the big splash. If we go back to normal presidents at some point in the future, I really don't think that this would become a norm in any way, where you have a top-down, initiation process to negotiations. But I need to give Trump some credit for taking the chance, and also at least getting Kim to come both rounds, because at least now we have things more clear and people are talking to one another. Also with North Korea, because we don't have normalized relations, because of the relatively, I don't want to put a black box, but a dark box in information that North Korea has been and remains, American bureaucrats don't have actual counterparts to work with. Unlike, with the Soviet Union, we had diplomatic relations. With Iran, we had a lot of contacts with the foreign ministry. So this is a different ballgame, and it's an unusual situation.
Dr. Seymour, more.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to what Kathy said. I think Trump has done a real service by breaking the taboo of meeting directly with North Korean leaders. So that's now another tool in our kit box. And the way diplomacy normally works is you have summit meetings in order to not only develop a personal relationship of trust and confidence, but also to, announce agreements that have been worked out beforehand. So that's now it seems to me, that's the process we're going to try to pursue. And I think a third summit is an excellent idea, as long as they go to the meeting with an agreement that's already been pre-cooked.
Can I add that
Sure.
You mentioned history. I want to bring in U.S. diplomatic history, and I think Gary would agree with my amendation to our comments that Trump has set a precedent for Republican leaders to engage directly with North Korea and North Korean leaders. Because we know during the Clinton administration that we got so close. And I think we need to give people credit for that process. So this is not a first in terms of that kind of a direct heads of state relationship, or at least a foreign ministry and Department of State with Madeleine Albright going to North Korea back 20 years ago. It's the fact that the Republicans now have to own up to Trump having started off this, a new set of options. That is now on the record.
So it makes it easier for a Democratic
Right.
president today,
Right.
and that's the point.
Because
All
he
right, let's
got
take a couple
criticized.
more from the audience.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talks, and I agree that this is not the best or, in a sense, positive things. And I noticed interesting thing is that we thought that North Korea is more preferred to have a longer period of negotiation, a longer time. And why did our United States would prefer to have a shorter? We solve this is in a 6-month time or long, but it kind of changed. This time in Hanoi, reportedly that Chairman Kim said, we have this very urgent issue, and 1 minute or 1 second matters. But why did President Trump said, no rush, that kind of things. Interesting. And secondly, regarding the sanctions relief or what the aim is concerned, that so anyway we have to wait to listen to what the North Korean side has to say about what happened. But according to what President Trump said, that they wanted all sanctions relief. So in a sense, we thought that North Korea has been a step by step or longer process in a sense. But they wanted to have the relief in its entirety. So that, because of that, it's collapsed. We couldn't reach it. So that's kind of interesting. Actually, in Vegan and Kim Il-sung's the negotiations, U.S. Vegan shows some sign that we can have a reduce the lower the sanctions. not until that all the thing complete deregulation. So it's interesting. So what's your view? And at the same time, it also relates to, of course, that it's positive that they continue, and the president also said that his committee will continue the dialogue. But at the same time, and also good that they will not resume that tax moratorium. But at the same time, as Toby said, that they will continue to produce fissile materials. So in a sense, it might be in our interest to have a freeze on really the production, for the production. Maybe that was their tactics on part of North Korea. But it kind of interesting, what happened is interesting to me. So what's your views?
Thank you. And let's take one more from Matt Bunn before we start.
So, I find myself in the interesting, unusual position of being maybe a little more hawkish in my reaction than my colleagues on the panel. But what worries me is what Will Toby was talking about, which is that in the past, the North has usually, when they weren't getting what they wanted, done something to try to make us pay attention. And I'm less optimistic than Will is that that's off the table now. It seems to me, over the course of the next couple months, if they continue to feel their suffering from sanctions and not making much progress in the United States, we have this statement in the New Year's Day speech about, if they don't play nice, we'll have to find a different path. What do the panelists think the odds of North Korea sort of doing something unfortunate to try to get us to pay attention and maybe, in a larger sense, shifting to a different path over the next few months are?
Mm-hmm. Let's start with Will Toby, if you've read.
Okay, since that question's fresh in our minds, and I think it's a good one, I should be very clear that I think that he's constrained, he's not bound without any possibility of mobility. I think it would impose costs. He's gained some prestige by having 2 meetings, he's gained at least some economic benefits, and then I think it's also important to remember that this plan, which again I'm not a huge fan of because of the fissile material, is really China's plan, which the U.S. rejected and then sort of subscribed to without saying that it had subscribed to it. So my guess is that if Kim now backs out of this plan, China might be more willing to impose costs than under other circumstances. So I would argue that he's at least a little constrained. I do worry about the danger you point out. On the DPRK being in a rush, and we're not in a rush, I think that is because of how President Trump defines success, and he thinks he's already got it. The North defines success in sanctions relief. They've got some, but not as much as they want. And then this 100% sanctions relief, I think that's not an uncommon, as Barry said, North Korean negotiating tactic to end up reaching for more. And it was almost inevitable because President Trump had taught them that lesson by canceling the military exercises. So why not try it? Maybe he'd give it to them. He didn't, so now they go back to some other approach.
So just on Matt's question, yes, obviously it's a risk. I mean, I agree with Will that there are constraints and costs if he breaks the freeze. The one issue I'm a little concerned about is that it's really a question of face. I mean, I wondered whether it was wise to cancel the ceremonial lunch. It might have been more politic to have that final lunch with Kim Jong-un and Trump. But of course, Kim, it's true that he does have domestic politics to deal with, but he deals with domestic politics in a way that's much more effective than President Trump can. Exactly. So if somebody dares to say that Kim Jong-un miscalculated and overreached and blew a chance for partial sanctions relief, that person's not likely to live very long. So I think he can manage his domestic politics in a way that makes it easier for him to go back with a more reasonable proposal. And on that question, I do think that there is a deal there that would exchange partial, as Will says, partial steps toward denuclearization, limits on fissile material production, in exchange for partial sanctions relief and some symbolic gestures, like liaison office and a peace deal. I would hold out for a complete freeze on fissile material production, because I don't think dismantlement of Pyongyang is a very heroic achievement. Now, whether you can get that deal, we don't know, but that's clearly the area where Began and Ambassador Kim are going to be negotiating as an initial step, some constraint on fissile material production, and hopefully that will be placed in the context of some rough overall framework or roadmap toward denuclearization. Although I think, even though Will and I would like to have a very well spelled out, time-bound roadmap, I don't think that's negotiable. I don't think the Republicans are going to commit to anything like that. I think they'll want to do piecemeal negotiation or piecemeal, denuclearization.
Yeah, to Matt's concerns, which are real, I offer concrete possibilities of some sort of retaliation. I don't think Kim and his cohort will resort to testing, at least in the near term, because they want to see how things play out. But they have in their arsenal cyber attacks, not toward the U.S. as much as toward South Korea, possibly Japan. So basically proxy attacks to make a point. Cozying up to China and because obviously the U.S. and Trump has made it pretty clear that if all this talk about, you can be an economic miracle, you can have the greatest economy, all this stuff is a way to bring in the future North Korea into a friendlier orbit for the United States, right? But North Korea will continue to play both U.S. and China off each other. And what I did read this morning in the KCNA was that North Korean officials have been deployed to Beijing pretty immediately to basically probably report, dialogue. So we could see that kind of both symbolic and substantive cozying up more and more. And then, of course, what we haven't talked about really or focused on is the impact on South Korea's options. And I think the failure in this regard of the Hanoi summit, it's really a failure for South Korea, or at least it's a big dent in terms of the policy trajectory that President Moon and his administration has been going on. Because now some of these projects that the North and the South had wanted to start can't be started or restarted. And I think that the North could easily, I could see easily, the North taking out its frustrations on South Korea, either through some minor military provocation, if we want to think about the scary stuff, but minor. And of course, in terms of either reducing or backpedaling on some of the so-called achievements, like security measures in the DMZ, backpedaling on those, and just general cooperation schemes. That's very possible. And if I were that would be probably the first route I would go, because that's a way to put pressure on South Korea, to put pressure on the U.S. But I think in terms of Kim, he can't afford to do too much. I don't think he can any longer murder his dissenters, at least I don't think he can murder anymore. At least in a publicized way. Because, we may not know about it, but I think that the bar is higher for him because he has tried to groom an image of himself as a diplomat and a statesman. And he's not just speaking to the United States or to South Korea, he's speaking to the whole world. And that means something for North Koreans and for Pyongyang as a state. So if he's thinking long term, he can't afford to take on the monstrous face that he once held to the international public's eye. And also, he can't afford not to pursue economic development. I mean, John and I are full believers that he is sincere about economic development. North Koreans never say economic reform in their own language, but economic development and reconstruction, to me, he has to have legitimacy in that area in order to be able to enjoy continued power. And so I think that the reactions, the negative reactions, will be tempered. They might be there, but they'll be tempered.
Let's follow this thread just a little bit to discuss the options. Maybe you don't have to prognosticate, but lay out the options that now face Kim and Moon and stuff. Gary?
So I think the failure of Hanoi is going to really damage Seoul's credibility as a mediator, because they tried very hard to orchestrate this mini deal that would have freed up South-North economic projects, which is the most important thing for Moon Jae-in. And the fact that they couldn't make that deal happen will, I think, lead them to be less trusted by both Washington and Pyongyang as an intermediary. And I want to ask John and Kathy how much that will damage Moon Jae-in's political position. As John and I learned last week, Moon's already suffering from some dissatisfaction, mainly because of issues concerning, things like, the domestic economy and equality and so forth. And obviously the conservatives are going to jump all over the failure of Hanoi as a demonstration that Moon is feckless and naive. So I'd be interested in hearing what you guys think.
Let's start with John.
Sure, very quickly. So, one thing I would caveat my comments, before I get to the failure of Hanoi, I just want to return to the theme of this doesn't add up. This is an outlier, and with this, trying to understand what happened here is an important part. One piece of this doesn't add up is lifting of sanctions. There's one individual on the North Korean side, and his whole job is to get sanctions lifted. That's Kim Young-chul. So he shows up, that's his one talking point, lift the sanctions. So he's a known quantity. It's not too partialistic. Lift them all up. So the fact that in the press conference, this was the point of surprise, that the North Koreans demanded the lifting of all sanctions, irrespective of what they were tying it to, but the fact that they were asking for the lifting of all sanctions, that doesn't add up. But to the point, with that caveat to President Moon, he is being assailed from two sides now. The economy is not doing well in South Korea, and he was elected for his economic package, not for his game plan in terms of improving relations with North Korea. And so now with this process not going well, he's kind of stuck. He's lost momentum here. And as Gary mentioned, if he's the person who's using the very scarce political capital to try to get momentum on the U.S. side, momentum from the North Korean side, get them to have the type of top-down symmetry, and then get the message out that President Trump should get the Nobel Peace Prize, then this is, I think, a very significant setback. And with President Moon now, reportedly as President Trump was flying off, he had the phone call with President Moon. And the message to him was, you deal with it now. And so if that's the function of where President Moon is at, it's a very difficult process. That means he has to figure out a different mechanism. He can't use the old mechanism that got us to this point. So this raises another big question mark that it is going back to the drawing board. I would look at this in terms of, with the focus on Seoul now, someone's going to get fired in Seoul. And it's this idea of, whose idea was it to have this low bar, this package? If it worked, it would have been great. You continue with it and you build on it as a beginning of real negotiations. So this is the element where that's the next shoe to drop that I'm looking for, is an announcement that someone is going to either resign or be fired.
Probably the foreign minister. That's normally why you have foreign ministers.
Dr. Moon.
Yeah, well, we could laugh, but the poor people were going to lose their jobs. Would it be a laughing matter for them? I think another lesson to be learned, is actually for the U.S. and North Korea. I mean, the fact that South Korea is in a tough position, that's a given, and John spoke to that. But I think yesterday I was on WBUR's On Point, and it was Victor Cha and me on as the experts doing the hour-long session. It was a fun, great, substantive session. And at one point, Victor said that South Korea has been serving as the unofficial spokesperson for North Korea, and I had to chuckle a little bit because it's true. First of all, North Korea, I hope, is going to learn not basically to deal with the U.S. directly, right, at all levels, and to work with South Korea separately from the U.S. Because there is, for those of you who are not Americans in the audience, in the U.S. when we were in grade school, at least when I was growing up, probably when all of us, I don't know about John and me, but we older folks, we played in classrooms in kindergarten the game of telephone, right? And you pass on, one person starts saying something and you keep passing it on, and by the time it gets to the sixth person in the row of seats, it's a completely different message, okay? And I had always worried about this. And of course, as human beings, psychologically, we add a little bit of what we want into that original objective message, which then gets morphed, okay? So I think DPRK needs to basically have consistent channeling of information, contacts with the U.S. I hope that's a lesson they learn. And by the same token, the United States. I have to give the U.S. more credit. The U.S. has been trying to deal with North Korea at the working level more consistently and has been rebuffed. And hopefully the U.S. can add a little more pressure that we really need to have these working level meetings and contacts. And I think South Korea, it would be best for South Korea at this point. President Moon achieved a lot, and I don't think we should take that away from him because of this setback in Hanoi. He achieved a lot, and all of this, the Singapore summit, the Hanoi summit, could not have happened without his near sacrificial efforts, meaning politically sacrificial efforts. However, right now may be the time for South Korea to focus on its own game plan with North Korea at a more humble level, not the grandiose projects. I personally thought South Korea is going too big too fast, without anything in return in terms of seeing change on the part of the North Koreans. So have a more modest set of goals, and maybe that'll also shake up the North Koreans. So I think everyone needs to reorient their communication channels, their conceptualization of what's possible, tone it down, and go back to working level meetings.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
so just to add to that, because John and I heard about this last week, the South Korean plan was to entertain and host Kim Jong-un in Seoul very shortly after the successful Hanoi summit. So I think an interesting question along the point that Kathy raised is whether or not Moon Jae-in carries through with that invitation now, or whether he decides that he really can't invite Kim Jong-un to Seoul because they don't have very much to announce in terms of North-South economic projects.
Will Toby briefly, then we'll go to one more question.
So I would dissent from my colleagues on the extent to which President Moon may have failed here. I think he will only have failed if he allows himself to have been painted as a failure. And I think there's much that he can do to build on this outcome. If I were advising the South Korean government, this is from the South Korean perspective, his perspective, not necessarily my own, but referencing again the Reykjavik analogy, what was widely perceived as a failure, we pointed out the places in which the progress had been made and the parties had gotten together on important issues. Both leaders, if I got it right, referenced liaison offices positively during the summit. And frankly, President Moon's primary interest is not denuclearization, it's a better political relationship. If liaison offices were established, it would be a huge home run for the South. And so if I were in the Blue House, I'd be advising him to be pursuing the places where progress was made.
I just want to build on that. So
No,
I just want to
okay, go ahead.
differentiate. It's not so much that I blame President Moon. I think he's going to be blamed. So I don't cite him as the link of the failure. He's going to be the fall guy. And that's the part that I think is really unfortunate.
And I
leaving
think
how much-
only if he allows himself to be the fall guy. I think he could.
I don't think it's an option.
All right, let's go back to our audience, please. Chris Lawrence?
Thanks. I'm Chris Lawrence. I'm a fellow here in the Managing the Atom project. So I think the panelists did a really good job painting the picture of what's available in the statement. So the picture is that Trump claims to have been, ready to sign something, and that the adults in the room sort of held him, or his advisors kind of held him back. But I think there's an interesting data point that could add some granularity, but it's speculative. So shortly leading up to the summit, some of the administration officials were expressing concern that Egan was getting too far ahead of his skis, which we may recognize as a reference to Colin Powell being reined in for the collapse of the agreed framework. So presumably somebody had to write something down for him to be for there to be something to sign. So do we really think that there was something written on paper? And presumably it would have been somebody under Egan or folks under Egan who would have written that down.
Thanks. Let's take another one too. Right here.
It's a basic civic education question. As a citizen and layman, consuming the news and including the opinions of experts on the news, should we have been surprised at what happened in the last 12 hours? To me, things happened as expected. In other words, why are the experts describing it as a surprising turn of events? Things have gone awry and so forth. When you go into meetings with no meeting of the minds, especially between two dictators, one elected, one unelected, but that's what happens. So we should not be surprised. So I'm just puzzled at why people are describing it as surprising turn of events. Things have gone awry. So.
Great. Let's take those two related questions. Was this in fact written down? Was there something ready to be signed, and should we be therefore surprised? Dr. Sim?
Well, I mean, obviously there was a written document. I mean, I don't know if it was ready to be signed, but Began had been in Hanoi for a week, meeting with his counterpart to negotiate a summit communique. So yes, there was a written document. There may have been brackets on some of the key sections, and I assume, well, the story out of Hanoi is that Began and Kim Yong-chol were not able to close the deal. That they met, and there were some areas where there was disagreement, and the expectation was that Trump and Kim, when they met together yesterday, or I guess today, in Hanoi, would deal with those issues, which they obviously were not able to. But, as to your question about the surprise, the reason why I thought there would be a document coming out of the meeting is because I had very low expectations of what would be produced. I thought we'd see a very small package of concrete steps, and then we'd see a commitment to try to negotiate an overall roadmap. And the fact that they couldn't even get that very, very modest result is what is surprising to me, because I think something was available, even if it wasn't very significant. I think they could have produced, a modest outcome. And maybe in a way it's better that they didn't. Maybe it's better, as we've all been saying, for the process in the long term, for both sides, that they weren't willing to settle for what would have been a pretty small outcome.
Dr. Moon?
I would have been less surprised if either of the leaders had canceled an appearance before the summit, because that almost happened with Singapore, with Trump canceling and then Kim saying no. I was expecting something like that as a possibility, but I am surprised by this outcome because a walkout, a cessation before the highly scripted and agreed upon protocols on a diplomatic level, that is unusual. And it signifies a serious rift. So on that level, it's a surprise. And also, I had low expectations. But the low expectations still included some evidence of small steps, baby steps. The fact that they basically walked out on each other, like I said, that is a serious thing in the diplomatic world. You just don't do that unless there's something serious going on.
John Park?
One of the interesting things, in agreement with the panel here, that we all had low expectations to begin with. And that's where the shock comes in. Low expectations, very subjective indicators from the two protagonists, and then you have this walkout. But the part that I think is really striking is that Chairman Kim was confident enough that there was almost real-time reporting back to North Korea what was happening. And so the sense of confidence that what he had expected as an outcome, he's reporting back. And so that's the element of, from a North Korean perspective, this is a development that it was a risk, they calculated it, but they made a decision that it's a low risk and proceeded with it. So that's the element of, President Trump is fine. He'll continue with his narrative, but it's Chairman Kim that's left kind of on as an outline. How that's addressed, that's the part that it's factual. The whole world media has reported on this. And that's the element that makes it very difficult to go back to this carefully scripted narrative. And that's why I think there is this big question mark of what happened.
Well, Toby?
I think in many ways the second question answered the first. This was somewhat predictable. It was predictable that the North would try and overreach based on the experience in Singapore, where they got some things from the president that they hadn't probably even expected to get. So why not press hard here? The fact that they tried and failed doesn't mean that it's over or that they have to retreat into a cave, never to come out again. They'll come back.
Well, no. I don't think that it's that dramatic. It's more this idea of the mechanism that they built. They can't go back to. They have to build another mechanism from scratch. That's the part that I think is daunting.
So I just want to emphasize, because Will and I have experienced this personally, it's very common for the North Koreans to table an outrageous proposal. And then when it gets rejected, they have no shame about coming back with a more reasonable proposal. That's very, very common. So it normally doesn't happen at the summit level. I mean, that's unusual. But I don't think that, if Kim Jong-un decides that he wants to keep this process going, having him come back with a more moderate, reasonable proposal is perfectly in keeping with, Korean negotiating tactics, and I don't think it represents, for him, the same kind of loss of prestige that it might be in other cultures.
And if he gets liaison offices out of it, he can represent
Peace
that
declaration.
as a huge concession to the North.
Let's do one more and then we'll give our panelists the last word. Questions? Right here?
Yeah. The issue of the black box view that the U.S. has of North Korea does concern me, because it makes it more difficult for our negotiators, whoever they turn out to be, to understand the thinking and approach of the North Korean negotiators. And I'm wondering if there isn't some mechanism for being able to increase that interchange between people in the leadership of North Korea and the people in the leadership of the U.S. country. Possibly exchanges of some kind for students. And I don't know if people have thought about that, but that would help in understanding better their approach.
I think that's great. Question about unblackboxing. Any others to add? Right here.
Yeah, I read somewhere that Donald Trump was looking for 5 more meetings in the future. Is that likely after this?
Likely more meetings in the future. Great. Let's go with those questions. And if the panelists could please also add any final thoughts that they would like to add as we go through these. Would you like to begin?
Yeah, briefly, 5 more meetings. Number one, I haven't read that, but I believe you. I believe you. That means he really wants that Nobel Peace Prize. And this is a man who hates to travel, so he really wants it very badly. I think that's just not likely. And also, frankly, I woke up this morning as a U.S. taxpayer saying, how much more of this can I support? I mean, this stuff is expensive, right? The summit meetings, working levels, that's okay. But, I thought, should I start a movement saying no more summits? Because this is just a waste of money. 5? No, I just think that would be ludicrous. In terms of the increasing exchanges, let's put it in terms of confidence-building measures, society to society, not just, officials to officials. I've always been a firm believer that is a primary step. And this is where the U.S. can learn from South Korea. South Korea has had numerous renditions over decades, some successful, some not, of making these overtures for people-to-people reconciliation. And this is what the U.S. is lacking. You can't work really with a not only a government, but just 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 maximum individuals, at a summit delegation, when you don't really understand what that society is about, and the society is not prepped either at home in the U.S. or in North Korea to deal with each other. So whether it's student exchanges, more access for humanitarian workers, there are American business people who are also very curious about the state of things in North Korea. And North Koreans at the grassroots level, civic level, at least as with counterparts in the U.S. and in Europe, they have been meeting periodically over the years, decades, to learn business English. What do they want to learn? Business English. What do they want to learn? International business law. I mean, we have proof of this, right? And unfortunately, with the Trump administration, at least speaking as an American citizen, many of these possibilities have been shut down in recent months because U.S. citizens cannot travel. There's basically a travel ban. So I think what the U.S. can do quietly, unprompted, is to lift some of this stuff if we want things to continue and encourage quietly other forms of engagement that might broaden interest and support, and also give some positive signals to the North Koreans that the U.S. continues to be serious.
Dr. Seymour.
So the answer to the black box problem is called espionage. Unfortunately, we don't do a very good job of that. So I think we're going to continue to suffer from not really understanding very well how the North Korean government makes decisions, how Kim Jong-un makes decisions. In terms of future meetings, I have to believe that Trump is very unlikely to schedule another summit unless he's pretty confident they're going to be able to announce a deal. And that's a good thing. As I said earlier, I think we're looking at a pretty limited window. I mean, if I was thinking in the administration, I'd be looking at this fall probably as the last opportunity to hold that third summit. Because in early 2020, I just think Trump is going to be so preoccupied with re-election that he may not have the time. And then finally, we've all been, we're very fresh from the event, and I do think we have to reserve judgment until we've looked a little bit more closely at what the North Koreans say. They will want to put out their narrative that it wasn't their fault, it was the Americans who asked for too much. And I really do think the way that they treat Trump is going to be a very important indication of how they intend to go forward. And if they continue to treat him with respect and praise, I think that's a very positive sign. So I would look for that before we can't be absolutely sure things won't go off the rails. And I'd feel better once we've seen the kind of official North Korean narrative.
Final thoughts from Will Toby?
With respect to the people-to-people issue, I'd be all for exchanges. I think that benefits us. We're a democracy, they aren't. I'd point out it's North Korea that's the closed society, not the United States. It's North Korea that returned a U.S. student in a condition near death for the grievous crime of tearing down a poster. So those are the people we're dealing with, and I think it's worth remembering that.
Yeah.
With respect to the sort of broader picture, I'd point out that nothing has been done to limit, let alone halt, the production of fissile material, and that is the most important issue here. And that we still see no evidence, in my view, of an interest in complete and verifiable denuclearization on the part of the North.
John, I'm going to give you 30 seconds.
Then I just have 20 seconds worth of comments. So going back to the title of our talk, it was a question of, is this the start of real negotiations? And I think the preparations to even get to this point, I think it remains a question, but I would go back to the mechanism that had been working up till now. There's some question marks to that mechanism. And the other piece of this that I think is a source of retrospection, all of the things that Will was talking about, those facts remain. And the hope was, if this was the beginning of real negotiations, then we could have some kind of coordinated mechanism to take advantage of this closing window that Gary mentioned, So all of these things and what Kathy mentioned about all these opportunities, those I think there's the question mark. And that's the part that with low expectations, with subjective indicators, it is a time where something aspect of going back to this kind of drawing box as we see the pieces coming out. But right now, the sense of this was a moment of taking the step back and trying to scratch your head and figure out what's going on.
All right, please join me in thanking our panel.